The AC's-2 ejection seat is an engineering marvel. Developed by McDonnell Douglas in the late 1970s, it represents decades of research into saving pilots from impossible situations. Flat spins, uncontrolled dives, inverted flight, catastrophic structural failures. The ACS-2 was designed to extract a human being from nearly any scenario and deliver them safely to the ground. But every system has limits, and the limit for the AC's-2 ejection seat is 600 knots. At that speed, the human body becomes a projectile. The wind blast strikes with the force of a collapsing building. Limbs become weapons against the torso. The aerodynamic pressure can rip a helmet clean off a skull, tear a mask from a face, shred a flight suit into ribbons. The violence is instantaneous and absolute. No human being is supposed to survive beyond that threshold. The physics simply do not allow it. On April 18, 1995, at 16 minutes past midnight, Captain Brian Udell of the United States Air Force ejected from his F-15E Strike Eagle over the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean. His airspeed indicator read 780 miles per hour. That is 180 miles per hour beyond what any human being had ever survived in an ejection scenario. This is the story of what happens to the human body at supersonic ejection speeds, and how one pilot refused to die when every law of physics said he should. The night of April 17, 1995 began like any other training mission at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. The 336th Fighter Squadron, known as the Rocketeers, had scheduled a routine nighttime exercise over the Atlantic Ocean. 4 F-15E Strike Eagles would launch for several hours of intercept training, formation practice, and simulated combat maneuvering in complete darkness. Captain Brian Udell was 31 years old. He had been flying fighters for nearly a decade, accumulating thousands of hours in some of the most advanced tactical aircraft ever constructed. He was known as a methodical pilot, not reckless, but aggressive when the situation demanded it. The kind of aviator who trusted his training implicitly and understood that complacency killed more pilots than combat ever would. His weapons systems officer that night was Captain Dennis White, riding in the rear seat of their two-seat Strike Eagle. White was 34, an experienced WSO who handled the radar, weapon systems, and navigation while Udell flew the aircraft. In the high-speed environment of tactical aviation, the pilot and WSO relationship is built on absolute trust. Each depends on the other for survival. The F-15E Strike Eagle is not a forgiving aircraft. It is 44,000 pounds of raw power designed for both air superiority and ground attack missions. Twin Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines produce 58,000 pounds of combined thrust, capable of pushing the aircraft beyond Mach 2.5 in level flight. The Strike Eagle can climb vertically, sustain 9G turns, and carry over 23,000 pounds of ordnance. In the hands of a capable crew, it is arguably the most lethal multi-role fighter ever built. But in the wrong conditions, that same power becomes a death sentence. The four-ship formation launched just before midnight, climbing to altitude over the Carolina coastline before heading east over the black expanse of the Atlantic. The exercise was scheduled to last several hours, long enough for the eastern horizon to show the first hints of dawn by the time they recovered back at Seymour Johnson. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. Radio calls were crisp and professional. Formation flying was tight. The weather was clear, with scattered clouds below and excellent visibility above. It was the kind of routine mission that breeds complacency in young aviators, but that veterans like Udell understood was merely the calm before potential chaos. At approximately 12:14 a.m., Udell's Strike Eagle was engaged in a simulated dogfight with another aircraft in the formation. These mock battles required aggressive maneuvering, high G-turns, sudden altitude changes, violent reversals, and precise throttle control to maintain energy while denying the opponent an advantage. Even in peacetime training, the margin for error is razor-thin. One wrong input at the wrong moment can send even the most stable aircraft into an unrecoverable flight condition. And that is exactly what happened. During a hard-turning engagement at approximately 10,000 feet, Udell's F-15E departed controlled flight. The aircraft entered what pilots call an adverse yaw spin, a violent rotating descent, where the jet tumbles through the sky like a leaf caught in a hurricane. The cockpit instruments became useless. The attitude indicator spun wildly. The altimeter began unwinding with terrifying speed. 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. He applied the textbook recovery procedures that had been drilled into him since pilot training: opposite rudder to stop the rotation, neutral stick to break the stall, throttles to idle to reduce asymmetric thrust. Nothing worked. The Strike Eagle refused to respond. The spin tightened. The descent accelerated. In the back seat, Dennis White could do nothing but monitor the instruments, call out altitudes, and trust that his pilot would find a way out. But Udell was running out of options, and he was running out of altitude far faster. 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The Atlantic Ocean waited below, invisible in the moonless darkness, but approaching at over 600 feet per second. Every military pilot knows the numbers. They are drilled into memory during survival training and reinforced through years of briefings, academics, and standardization check rides. For the AC-2 ejection seat, those numbers represent the hard boundary between life and death. Maximum safe ejection speed, 600 knots. Above that threshold, the wind blast becomes theoretically unsurvivable. The aerodynamic forces at transonic and supersonic speeds will tear equipment from the body, dislocate joints, cause fatal trauma before the parachute can even begin to deploy. The engineers who designed the seat tested it extensively within its envelope. Beyond that envelope, they could only theorize about what would happen. Minimum safe ejection altitude, 10,000 feet above ground level, when the aircraft is in an uncontrolled flight condition. Below that altitude, there may not be sufficient time for the seat to stabilize, for the drogue chute to deploy and slow the pilot, for the main canopy to inflate and arrest the descent. The mathematics of falling bodies is unforgiving. Gravity does not negotiate. Brian Udell's F-15E was now falling through 4,500 feet. His airspeed, rather than decreasing in the spin, was actually climbing. The aircraft was now accelerating past 700 miles per hour as it corkscrewed toward the ocean. He had already violated both critical limits. The ejection seat that was designed to save his life was now operating in a realm where its engineers had never intended it to function. But staying in the aircraft meant certain death. The ocean was less than 10 seconds away. There was no decision to make, only a gamble to take. Udell keyed the intercom to the back seat. "Bail out! Bail out! Bail out!" The words reached Dennis White through his helmet headset. There was no time for questions, no time for questions, no time for confirmation. White reached for his ejection handle immediately. A fraction of a second later, Brian Udell pulled his own handles. The twin ejection seats fired within milliseconds of each other. The rocket motors ignited with simultaneous detonations that blew the canopy clear and launched both men into 780 miles per hour of open air. What happened next should not have been survivable. The physics are absolute. The engineering calculations are clear. The testing data is definitive. At 780 miles per hour, the human body becomes a projectile subjected to forces that exceed the design limitations of bone, tissue, and tendon. The wind blast struck Brian Udell with a force equivalent to running face first into a concrete wall. His helmet was ripped from his head in the first millisecond. His oxygen mask followed immediately after, torn from his face before his brain could process what was happening. His flight suit shredded. The survival vest that carried his radio, flares, and emergency equipment disintegrated like tissue paper in a hurricane. The aerodynamic forces broke his left arm in 3 places. The shoulder dislocated. The elbow shattered. Bones that had never experienced trauma beyond the occasional bruise were snapped like dry twigs by wind pressure alone. But the AC-2 seat continued to function. The rocket motor burned for the programmed duration. The drogue chute deployed. The stabilization system engaged. The main parachute canopy inflated at 4,000 feet, just barely enough altitude for a full deployment before Udell hit the water. He was alive, conscious, aware that he had just survived something that should have killed him instantly, and falling toward the black Atlantic with one working arm. Captain Dennis White's ejection seat performed exactly as designed. His rocket motor fired. His drogue chute deployed, his main parachute opened. But the forces that Brian Udell somehow withstood were too much for Dennis White. The wind blast trauma was catastrophic and instantly fatal. He likely died within a fraction of a second of leaving the aircraft before he ever hit the water, before his parachute ever had a chance to deploy. before he experienced a single moment of fear in the ocean. He was 34 years old. Brian Udell hit the Atlantic Ocean at approximately 12:16 a.m. The water temperature was 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to induce hypothermia in less than an hour. His survival vest was gone. His helmet was gone. His radio was gone. Every piece of equipment designed to keep him alive in the water or signal his location to rescuers had been destroyed during the ejection. His left arm was useless, a mass of shattered bone and torn tissue that sent waves of agony through his body with every movement. He inflated the small flotation bladders built into his flight suit, one of the few pieces of equipment that had survived the ejection intact. He was alone in the dark, no lights visible on the horizon, no sound except the wind and the waves, no way to signal for help, no idea how long he would have to survive before rescue arrived, or if rescue would arrive at all. The first hour was survival, treading water with one arm, fighting the hypothermia that was already beginning to slow his thoughts and numb his extremities, keeping his head above water, preventing shock from overwhelming his system, staying conscious through pain that would have incapacitated most people on dry land. The second hour was endurance. The cold had moved beyond discomfort into genuine danger. His core body temperature was dropping. His muscles were stiffening. His thinking was becoming clouded. The third hour was willpower. His body wanted to quit. The pain in his arm had become a constant scream. The cold had progressed to the point where drowning would have felt like relief. But Brian Udell did not quit. He kept his head above water. He kept breathing. He kept moving his one good arm just enough to maintain flotation. He survived because giving up was simply not an option. His brain would accept. The same discipline that made him a methodical pilot kept him alive in the water. The fourth hour brought hallucinations. Hypothermia was affecting his brain function. He saw lights that weren't there, heard voices in the wind, believed he was having conversations with people who weren't there. The line between consciousness and unconsciousness was becoming dangerously thin. But some part of his mind, some core of awareness that refused to be silenced, kept him moving, kept him fighting, kept him alive. At approximately 4:20 a.m., 4 hours and 4 minutes after ejection, a Coast Guard helicopter spotted the parachute canopy floating on the water. The aircrew descended. They found Brian Udell tangled in the parachute shroud lines, barely conscious, hypothermic, and in shock. His core body temperature had dropped to 92 degrees deep hypothermia, a condition that kills most people who reach it. As the Coast Guard crew pulled him from the water and into the helicopter, Udell was barely conscious, hypothermic, bleeding, his left arm a ruined mass of torn tissue and shattered bone. But he was alive. He managed one question before shock took him completely. "Did you find Dennis?" The crew's silence told him everything he needed to know. Captain Dennis White's body was recovered later that morning. His injuries from the high-speed ejection had been catastrophic and instantly fatal. He likely died within a fraction of a second of leaving the aircraft, before he ever hit the water, before his parachute ever had a chance to deploy, before he experienced a single moment of fear in the ocean. He was 34 years old. Brian Udell spent months recovering from his injuries at military medical facilities. His left arm required multiple surgeries to repair the massive structural damage. The shattered bones were pinned and plated, the torn ligaments reconstructed, the dislocated shoulder rebuilt. Nerve damage was extensive. Physical therapy pushed him to the absolute limits of his pain tolerance day after day, week after week. Throughout the recovery, Udell maintained a single unwavering goal: return to flying status. The military doctors were skeptical. The flight surgeons who reviewed his case expressed serious doubts about whether he would ever regain sufficient function in his left arm to safely operate a high-performance aircraft. The injuries he had sustained were simply too severe. The medical boards that would have to approve his return to flying status had seen similar cases before, and those cases almost always ended careers. But Udell refused to accept that outcome. He approached his rehabilitation with the same determination he had brought to surviving the ejection itself. Every therapy session, every exercise, every painful milestone was another battle to be won. 18 months after the ejection that should have killed him, Captain Brian Udell was cleared to return to full flight status. He walked back into the squadron ready room at Seymour Johnson. not as a ground-bound instructor or staff officer, but as a fully qualified F-15E pilot. The Air Force marveled at his recovery. The aviation medicine community studied his case extensively. He had become living proof that human will could overcome what machines and mathematics said was impossible. But the ejection had planted invisible wounds as well. Years later, during a routine medical examination required for his civilian pilot certificate, doctors discovered something alarming. Brian Udell had developed a dissection in his aorta tear in the inner layer of the main artery carrying blood from his heart to the rest of his body. Aortic dissections are often caused by extreme physical stress, by forces that strain the arterial walls beyond their design limits. The doctors traced the origin of the dissection to the massive deceleration forces Udell had experienced during the supersonic ejection in 1995. His aorta had been slowly tearing for years, a silent time bomb planted in his chest on that April night over the Atlantic. The condition was immediately life-threatening. A complete rupture would be fatal within minutes and required him to permanently ground himself from all flight operations. The FAA revoked his medical certificate. His flying career was finally over, not because his skills had diminished, not because his courage had failed, but because the price of his survival had finally come due 13 years after the fact. But Brian Udell's legacy extends far beyond his personal story of survival and loss. His ejection became one of the most extensively studied cases in the history of aviation survival medicine. Engineers at Martin Baker, Boeing, and various government research facilities analyzed every aspect of what had happened: the forces he experienced, the equipment failures, the mechanisms that had somehow allowed the AC-2 seat to function at speeds far beyond its design envelope. New testing protocols were developed. Training programs were updated to reflect the terrifying realities of high-speed ejection. Design improvements were implemented that would benefit future pilots in similar emergencies. The British company Martin Baker, which has manufactured ejection seats for military forces around the world since the pioneering days of aviation, maintains meticulous records of every life saved by their equipment. Each pilot who successfully ejects using a Martin Baker seat is inducted into an exclusive fraternity known as the Ejection Tie Club. They receive a commemorative tie, a pin, and membership in a community that only those who have pulled the handles can truly understand. As of the most recent count, over 7,700 pilots owe their lives to Martin Baker ejection seats. Brian Udell holds a special place within that community, not simply as a survivor, but as the man who proved that human beings can endure more than engineers ever calculated, more than physics ever predicted, more than medicine ever believed possible. When asked about the ejection, Brian Udell does not speak in terms of luck or fate or divine intervention. He speaks of training, of instinct, of the fraction of a second that exists between making a decision and executing it. He pulled those ejection handles, knowing that the numbers were against him, knowing that the seat was designed for conditions he had already exceeded, knowing that survival was statistically improbable. He pulled them anyway, because the alternative was certain death. Dennis White pulled his handles too. He did everything right. He heard the command from his pilot. He reacted immediately. He trusted the system that was designed to save his life. He made exactly the same decision that Udell made, a fraction of a second later, and he died. Not because he failed, not because he hesitated, not because he did anything wrong. He died because survival at those speeds is not guaranteed. It is an aberration, an exception, a statistical outlier that defies the rules we build our engineering upon. The fighter-pilot community understands this paradox intimately. Every time they strap into an aircraft that can exceed twice the speed of sound, every time they push the envelope of what airframes and engines and human bodies can withstand, they are accepting a fundamental bargain. The ejection seat is there. It offers a chance, but it does not offer a promise. Brian Udell won his bet against physics that night. 780 miles per hour, 4 hours alone in a dark, cold ocean. One working arm. No helmet, no raft, no flotation device, no radio, no rescue equipment. And he lived. What separates survival from death at those margins is not always visible. Sometimes it is the angle of a limb at the moment of ejection. Sometimes it is the timing of a parachute deployment. Sometimes it is something that no engineer can model, no computer can simulate, and no training can teach. Sometimes it is simply the absolute refusal to die. The ACES-2 ejection seat has a maximum safe speed of 600 knots. That is what the technical manuals state. That is what the engineers calculated based on extensive testing. That is what every pilot learns in survival school. On April 18, 1995, Brian Udell proved those numbers wrong. Not by surviving the ejection itself, though that defied every prediction, but by surviving everything that came after.